So today, Mackenzie, you want to talk about trauma, and I think it's really interesting to think about how trauma we can think of as like an event that happened or something that maybe happened to us. But today, you want to kind of talk about how the brain is literally rewired in response to some of these traumatic events. And I don't know. I wonder if a good place to start would be to kind of talk about what is trauma. I think about a lot of clients who come in and initially they don't think that they have trauma and they maybe think of it as like a capital T, like I went through a traumatic event. And maybe they don't have as much of an understanding of um, just how the brain is shaped by particularly negative experiences throughout our life. But I thought if we could kind of talk about that a little bit, maybe to start of what is trauma.
I think a helpful way to see it is almost like in a nature documentary. So in one of the many fascinating things I think that pull us toward watching documentaries about nature is this fascination with resilience in a harsh environment, surviving a harsh environment. And in many ways, trauma is simply an understanding of adapting to a harsh environment. And so what happens with trauma is that it is a person's brain wired to adapt to survive in a very harsh environment, keep them alive. That's what the brain's doing.
Wow. Okay. So, when you say that, I picture like a snow leopard, right? Who has had to, maybe over, I don't know how long, like become white, or how maybe certain animals have learned to be aggressive in certain situations. This is kind of what you're picturing with like nature documentary. It's
Yeah.
kind of fascinating to see an animal have to figure out how to adapt to an environment and survive in that kind of situation.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you can see the understandably so, right, of that portion of, what it takes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so let's say somebody is hearing the word trauma and they go, I don't know if I have trauma or not. If a person has been traumatized or has had to adapt to a harsh environment, how might they know?
Yeah, that's a great question because oftentimes I think traumatic events get conflated or confused with trauma. So, for example, if someone's in a car crash, we might think, okay, well, there's trauma there, but not necessarily so. So, I think some things to look for when you are looking to see, do I have trauma? Are some things that are connected to different structures of the brain. So, for example, hypervigilance. There's a portion of our brain called the amygdala, which controls our fear response. And oftentimes, even when someone has been in a very harsh environment, they've had to survive and they're put into a safe environment. It doesn't always mean that the brain has caught up. So you can tend to see imagine like a rabbit in the wild exhibiting like skittish behavior when they hear a noise. That might actually be something that you'd experience in yourself with a door slam or the auditorial quality of someone's voice. Finding yourself getting skittish or very high alert, even when you look around and you realize the environment is logically safe.
Yeah, I talked with Giancarlo Licata, who does a lot of ADHD kind of brain mapping stuff. And something that we are talking about is how when there has been a traumatic experience, like you're talking about, even when they're put in a safe environment, there's going to be some kind of holding on to the past in some way, the past way of relating to the negative experience. And the example that we started to use was like, my family, we have a cat, and the first few months of its life, it was in the wild, and then it was brought into a shelter. And we've treated this cat incredibly nicely, but like this cat, she just acts as if we're going to hurt her.
Oh.
She's always scared. She'll hide. Anytime we go to try to gently pet her, she hides. Whereas our other cat, who was always raised around people in a safe environment, it's just so easy, more like a dog, comes up to you and wants to be pet and all this kind of thing. And it's interesting how even though it was just that few formative years of that cat's experience when it was first being raised, that it was out in the wild, it still is imprinted on its brain of this way of adapting to a harsh environment. Something I'm interested in hearing, you wrote this article on kind of the 5 ways trauma rewires the brain. And I don't know, maybe we can kind of walk through some of those some of the ways that our brains are specifically wired around trauma.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I keep thinking about your cat.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and, I think one of the things that occurred to me was what happens when logical thinking gets interference. And, your cat, in many ways, the part of the brain, the hippocampus that affects memory and learning, what can happen is with trauma, the past and the present blur together. And so everything can represent something in the past, even though now it could be for affection or safety or, benign. So I think that is one thing that when I think about the way that trauma changes the brain, logical thinking is impacted.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that comes to mind too is, really with emotion regulation. So, oftentimes that has to do with the prefrontal cortex and that structure kind of, again, logical thinking helps us kind of regulate, assess, understand, label, express things. And that also gets interfered with something like trauma. When your brain has been adapted structurally to be in a harsh environment, it, reasonably would make sense for a stray dog to snap, be aggressive or withdraw around, a foreign animal or a person. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that that dog is inherently aggressive, but its brain was wired to keep it alive.
Yeah. Okay. So with the prefrontal cortex there. So wait, so first to back up, you mentioned a few different brain areas. The first is the amygdala. And you mentioned that having to do with this kind of inflamed fear response
Right.
that can stay there. Then you talked about the hippocampus, which has to do with maybe more, well, I guess all kinds of memory, but let's say explicit memory, in that certain things are recalled differently depending on your current context, right?
Right.
And then you're talking about the prefrontal cortex and this idea of like how your logical thinking is impaired, or I wouldn't say impaired, like you're talking about it's adaptive too. It shifts into a different kind of mode when we're in trauma, right? I wonder, you're talking about these animal examples, but I wonder if we could kind of maybe zoom in on what that might feel like to a person who has trauma, who, let's say they notice themselves throughout the day feeling stressed. They're having difficulty sleeping. They don't know why. It's not tied to a specific thing. Even when they're on vacation, even when they're taking a day off, they still feel this kind of like tingling anxiety.
Yeah.
How might they understand these different brain areas and what might be happening for them?
I think one way to see it is that you are probably in an environment that is not going to harm you, but your brain has not caught up. So you might have difficulty sleeping, chronic stress, feeling jumpy. You might be perceiving like a misunderstanding as something much bigger, much more threatening than when you notice you walk away from it, you realize, oh, that was actually much smaller than it felt in the moment. Those kinds of things can be indicative that I'm kind of hardwired for survival here.
Yeah. So what about, I mean, you mentioned the prefrontal lobe. What might be going on for them there? Let's say when they're trying to, I don't know, work on something, or they're trying to plan something, or they're trying to engage in a conversation. How is that prefrontal lobe impacted by trauma? What might be happening there?
I think that a part of what happens in trauma is an overwhelm of the brain and the body. And so if your brain structures are designed to prevent that overwhelm from happening again, then what happens when, let's say, you're getting frustrated with a project? Well, logical thinking goes offline. The brain is focused on preventing that overwhelm from happening. And so you might go into protective mode. You might get bigger. Your emotions don't have the regulation that has been turned offline. And you go into this position that would look a lot like living in a harsh environment.
Yeah. Okay. So in the prefrontal lobe you're talking about, it's like it just gets kind of shut off. Like there's not as much things going on up there when
Right.
we're more scared or overwhelmed, right? And what are some of those things that are going offline? When
Mhm.
I think of it, it's easy to think like maybe logical
Mhm.
thinking or planning, something like
Mhm.
that. But I don't know. Could you help people
Mhm.
kind of understand what are some of the other parts of them up there that are kind of going kind of dark there?
Yeah, I would see it as a lot of the things that allow us to connect. So either connect with our internal
Hmm.
thoughts or connect with another person. That kind of stuff gets shut down in preservation of keeping you literally alive.
Hmm.
So what can happen is there's a lot of problems that can surface when we're trying to relate because we're in this mode that our brain it
Hmm.
has us in, and so we can start to see difficulties with conflict, difficulties with trust, difficulties with self-talk
Hmm.
and self-perception. That's a big one that trauma alters.
Hmm.
A lot of the time when you're in a harsh environment getting harsh messages, especially at a very very young age, you internalize that. And usually at a very, very young age, what happens is you are the most logical place to put the responsibility for the dangerous
Hmm.
world. We want to keep connected to the people keeping us alive.
Hmm.
So we internalize things like we're bad, we're too much, we're difficult.
Hmm.
And those kinds of things are what those disconnections from relationship are really
Hmm.
what get
Right.
tanked.
Right. So you're saying that sometimes they end up having to tell themselves something about what's happening to put the blame on themselves rather than kind of point the blame outward or get upset when they're really trying to stay attached as best they can. But that's really sad when I think about that. Of thinking about somebody who's traumatized, and then more than anything, they need to connect with other people around them. Let's say a spouse or whatever it is, church community, or the ways that those connections end up being really supportive to us. But it's sad to think about when somebody's in that traumatized position. Let's say they're just chronically anxious, chronically they can't really cool down.
Right.
That those parts of them that should be able to connect with other people, it's like what happens over time when that isn't available to them, when everything feels so overwhelming, shut down,
Mhm.
that I just picture their world getting smaller and smaller and them
Mhm.
getting more and more afraid.
Mhm.
And this is something I've seen with some clients, but it just seems almost um, like it just seems sad of thinking about somebody who's been traumatized and what they need more than anything is to connect, and yet those parts of their brain are shut down, the moral parts, the parts of like languaging their experience, reflecting on their own experience,
Right.
asking a friend out to lunch, talking about things that matter to them. These are the harder things when you're in that kind of trauma position.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, they really are. And you can see from the way we're talking how much patience is important. If you're thinking about, does this relate to myself or someone I know? How much it is important to be patient. And
Hmm.
also, you're right, sad is the right word because in some ways it can become a self fulfilling prophecy. So if your brain is wired to keep you alive, and there's all these responses fight or flight,
Hmm.
aggression, withdrawal, and you're in that kind of mode, and you see that your relationships are struggling, or there's, they're not bringing you the things that you need as in the connective sense,
Hmm.
you can start to make meaning of that, of reinforcing, I knew it, I knew the world wasn't
Hmm.
safe, I knew this person couldn't be trusted. And in many ways it does make the world smaller because you're seeing more and more evidence,
Hmm.
and that is what makes it very sad.
Yeah. The world becomes smaller and smaller. And there, you said there's this self fulfilling prophecy of as they interact with the world, then, and they're afraid, they end up kind of confirming, oh, see, no one's really here for me. No one,
Right.
that to me sounds like agoraphobia. Like agoraphobia is this idea of like, it usually happens around like other issues like panic attacks, let's
Hmm.
say, or other kind of chronic surprising pain issues like IBS or things like this, where the person, will will kind of retreat more and more from the world. Everything becomes too scary. They're worried that they're going to have an attack, and so they pull back. They don't venture far from home. But then, their support systems become that much more sparse, unsupportive, and then they become that much more scared. And so it's this, similar to what you're saying, this downward spiral. But I wonder how much we can do that socially. I think for example, there are traumas that we all share. For example, going through something like the Eaton fires, where everybody felt really incredibly distressed, worried, freaked out. What if this is me? Or even if it was them, that something happened, they lost their house. The insecurity and stability of that, political changes. We can think about anything that kind of affects all of us in some way. And then you think about how much, when we all carry that anxiety, what is lost in terms of our ability, our resource to be able to connect, or to be able to be the versions of ourselves that we want to be with each other and that we need from each other.
Right.
I think there's like a loss there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. If in many ways, I think it's quite clear where we could point to. That's like, oh, our environment is harsh. Is it demonstratedly becoming more harsh? But, when you think about those things, there are harsh environments that we're weathering every day. And collectively, something like the Eaton fires, something like, a lot of the polarization in our political, our national political identity, like a lot of those things really can, we're designed to keep ourselves alive. And we can see how, a lot of that gets facilitated. Yeah. The fear that can end up kind of changing the way we relate to each other. I kind of want to ask a question here, kind of that I hear sometimes from clients, and I'm sure you have too. But sometimes when I suggest, like, maybe there was something that was difficult or traumatic that happened to you that impacted the way that you see the world, something that they sometimes come back with is something like, yeah, but I don't think I've had it as bad as somebody else. What about, like, aren't these first world problems that I've dealt with? My mom, my dad, a loss at school, or at work. And then they will reference a third world country and people who have experienced starvation or famine or abuse, genocide, whatever, Right.
And then they look at their own trauma and they go, I don't know that I experienced trauma, and why should this be impacting me? I just think that's a kind of common question that people can kind of wrestle with when they start to consider how they've been impacted by their own experiences. Yeah,
absolutely. In many ways you want to ask, why is that important that someone else has it worse? Maybe someone anonymous or in some other region of the world that we hear about. It's very painful. And in some ways, logically, that could be true. But when you think about the way the brain is, we all have, we're roughly made of the same stuff. And so in some ways, your brain has structured itself to survive in a harsh environment, just in the way that someone, in an even harsher environment would have. The degree of severity is different, but you can see the need for compassion for yourselves and the way that we are wired up.
Yeah. I think there's like there's a reason that they go there, right? We can always compare ourselves to somebody who's had something worse,
Right.
It's interesting. I think about some people who I know who lost a home in the fire, and then when I give some kind of empathetic, response, and like, I'm so sorry, or that must have been hard, they go, well, I know other people who had it worse. I don't know why I'm complaining. And I wonder if there's like just a tendency that we can do emotionally to try to distance ourselves from our own pain, because, and use some other experience to kind of reduce our own suffering in some way, to make ourselves kind of distant from maybe what we need for our own pain.
Yeah. And you might be able to see that as adaptive too, of, how is that helping you to do that? And what is that helping someone with? And, something that I see about too with clients is very much, it was not that bad.
Mm-hmm.
And what does it mean to look at it most clearly? What kind of things or beliefs would you have to let
Mm-hmm.
go of if you saw your pain
Mm-hmm.
most clearly?
Yeah. Yeah.
It can be a hard and scary thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The pain. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about kind of where the pain comes from for a lot of people who have had trauma. What is it about, let's say, a negative experience that ends up rewiring the brain? And what's the difference between, let's say, somebody who's been through this, two people who've been through the same experience?
Mm-hmm.
And let's say one of them came out with kind of PTSD-like symptoms, like constant anxiety, flashbacks,
Mm-hmm.
difficulty sleeping. Then the other one, more or less normal, okay. What are some things that we might think about for what makes a difference for people when they've experienced something negative in terms of what ends up impacting them
Mm-hmm.
and what ends up being kind of okay and not as much of an impact?
Yeah. I mean, what a question, because I think there's a lot to be said there. I think it can be distilled roughly into their external and internal resources. So, if you take two people, let's say that, let's say their home was broken into, there was an intrusion.
Yeah.
What makes one person develop an onset of PTSD symptoms and the other not?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in many ways, you can go way farther back. And you can look at the nurture and you can look at the nature. But if you go way farther back, what kind of internal resources were they modeled? Were they given? What kind of environment did they grow up in? What kind of internal resilience do they have? What kind of self-soothing tools do they have? What's their ability to regulate their emotions? And if you get people that are different in those ways, well, if they hit a traumatic event, it's going to impact them differently because their level of resilience and vulnerability is different. You could also say the same thing with external factors. So, what is the person's economic and social resourcing? And then also, what is their genetic disposition? Are they genetically inherently a sensitive soul? Or are they wired up a little bit more resilient in certain ways already? All of those things come into play with trauma and who incurs trauma and who does not.
And those things can make the difference between somebody having trauma and somebody, let's say, recovering from that same experience. You're saying all these things, the external, the internal, and genetic factors, all contribute to kind of what can hold, what the container that can hold this experience.
Right.
Okay, so you talked about internal resources. Can you say a little bit more about that? What do you mean about what this person is given? If it's not just genetics, let's say, or not just present things of like, when you say that they have some kind of internal resource, what are you meaning there?
Yeah, I think I mean a lot of things. But one, for example, is let's say the way that you talk to yourself. So that's an internal resource. And if it was modeled for you very early on, your self-talk is harsh and critical, shaming, that resource is in many ways not available to you in the way that people, as they were developing, were given messages of encouragement, of empowerment, of being knowing that they have support in getting out of difficult situations. And so one internal resource is really the way that you talk to yourself. That, do you have a level of self-compassion that can act as a balm or a buffer when, let's just say, going back to this example of home intrusion, someone, broke in, took all your stuff. It's like, in one scenario, why didn't I choose better locks? Why did I leave the house this day?
It's my fault.
It's my fault. Stupid, stupid, stupid.
Yeah, right.
And then in another one, it's like, okay, well, you've had years of training in when something goes wrong, okay, sitting down, feeling what you're feeling, being able to recognize, understand, label, express and ultimately regulate your emotion so that you're able to better cope with what just happened to you.
Yeah. I remember a time early when I was really young. My dad would take us backpacking when we were like 4 or 5 as little kids, me and my brother. And I remember we would get to a point, for example, where we're on the trail in the middle of nowhere with just the stuff we have on our backs,
Yeah.
kind of a vulnerable place, right? Also exciting for a little kid. But I remember a storm would roll in, and I remember it had started to rain, and now we're getting all soaked. We're miles away from our destination. But I remember my dad being like, I know it sucks. We have to keep going. But that experience right there of his handling that way, I mean, there's lots of other things he could have done, right? He could have been like, dang it, we should have turned around, or he could have been just felt like it was like all for nothing, or,
Right.
and then it would have been a really sour trip. But it was like his own internal capacity was like passed down to me in that moment of, I know it sucks. We can keep, like it felt connected, like we're going to be okay, but we have to keep pushing. Is first of all what helped us get to where we needed to go, but also helped us come back to safety. It's going to be okay. Help me see the road ahead. And that served as like a waypoint for me, or an internal capacity for me, when I think about things that are hard or traumatic, like something like a break-in or something happens unexpected, where there's a similar voice that I can access in my mind that feels like that, like we can keep going, we can keep pushing, it's going to be okay. But that's what I think of when you think of the internal resource of, it's only internal because at one point it was a communication. Right. From a caregiver, from a mentor, from a coach, to a person in the middle of something hard, whether it's when you're a really young baby, when you're a toddler, when you're an adolescent, that feels like it lays down some kind of template for how do I get through something like this. I just think that there's something so powerful about the way that those things are transmitted through other people who have some kind of ability to access something for themselves in those moments.
Yeah, that's really lovely. In many ways, we lend our capacities to each other, and then we can internalize each other's capacities, and that's very cool. That's also a beautiful thing of our human resilience,
Yeah. Okay, so you mentioned 5 ways that trauma. I want to make sure we have all of them, but the only ones I remember are the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal lobe.
Right.
What are the other 2 we got?
Right. I would say we also have. I mean, you could attach to amygdala hypervigilance. That's kind of one way that the brain rewires with trauma, and then prefrontal cortex, how much we're able to regulate our emotions in a given moment, in the moments that we need to be able to, or at least have access to an ability to get us to a place where we can regulate our emotions, and then this other one is connected to self-perception. We just talked about internalized voices. We talked about being lent someone else's voice.
Yes. Yeah.
And self-perception is just a huge one. And for anyone wondering if they have trauma, that's a really big one. Like if you find yourself in experiences where after the fact, you realize you were in a misunderstanding or a conflict that's much lower stakes than it felt in the moment. So, in retrospect, that's pretty indicative of there's some kind of self-perception that was altered from some sort of harsh environment you had to adapt to.
I think it's a really great example, and something I hear often when people come to therapy. They feel like they've made a mountain out of a molehill in something in their life.
Yeah.
Some life transition feels like everything's going to fall apart, when they probably know logically, like, I know it's not that way, but I can't stop feeling that everything's going to blow up.
Yeah.
Or whenever we get into an argument about the dishes or whatever it is, it feels like the world's falling apart, feels like everything is going to blow up, feels like something wrong is going to happen. And I think that's a really, really disorienting place for people to be. But I think you're kind of speaking to that of like, there's something that they are feeling maybe about who they are or what the world is that is kind of like baked in from some other experiences that they've had.
Baked in is a great description. Something that's really powerful. I mean, there's so much about the natural world that translates, but something really powerful is to think about elephants too. And they're so fascinating. But one of the things you see with elephants that spend years in captivity is as soon as that cage door opens, they stay put. And that's a lot of brain structure. That's a lot of perception that they are in captivity, despite the obvious surroundings indicating they are not.
And you kind of want to say, it's okay, like go. And everything in them has been formed like jello into this cage where this is all that they know.
Right.
Even when the cage is open. And you're saying that this is kind of what happens when somebody's feeling like something is really blown up in their life. It's like something feels really, really overwhelming, is that sometimes it's maybe kind of returning to like the cage. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's another, I think, blinking red light of there might be some trauma here. Is I see clients that are successful and then they experience success, but it's incongruent with their perception of themselves. And it causes this tension or this disconnect inside of themselves that is really hard to figure out. And so
so what do they do in that situation? So you're saying like, what's like the tendency for them to do there? Is it like self-sabotage? Is that what you're meaning?
Absolutely. Think about the things that you can change, something that's baked in or your external environment. Well, you're going to conform your environment or something that is occurring to you to your level of perception. It usually does not happen overnight the other way around. So very much so. I think that, when people have harsh narratives of themselves or have kind of a belief system about themselves that they're starting to see evidence against, they will try and fit that evidence back into their perception of who they think they are.
Like they keep wanting they'd rather give up the success and hold on to the negative belief about themselves.
I think there's a relief there for people.
Yeah, that's like a trap, isn't it? And you go, well, what you want to think, and I see this with clients too, where they go, once I achieve success, once I get the promotion, whatever, then I'll be able to finally feel at peace or have all the things I want, whatever. But you go, haven't you already achieved success? Haven't you already, and you still don't feel any closer to it? There's a way that even when they do achieve some success, they kind of ignore it, right? They kind of push that information away as much as they want it. There's this tendency, isn't there, to kind of push it away because our minds can kind of be tending to rewire themselves, re-experience this kind of older pattern over and over and over again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the term cognitive dissonance comes to mind, where there's some kind of discomfort that's hard to tolerate about, the internal and the external, or two different ideas colliding. And I think that is something where naturally unexamined or without kind of entering into this curiosity of, is there trauma here? We will tend to go into the place of least resistance, the homeostasis of, okay, let's quelch this discomfort by getting back in line with what I've learned to believe about myself.
Yeah, sad. I mean, I can think it's kind of like the example would be, let's say somebody finally, again, achieving success, but they've always felt like, let's say the younger sibling or the runt of the family, or they, and they've always felt like if they're ever successful, it's going to feel threatening to the family, and so they might end up giving away or somehow let's say gambling away or giving away or, not taking in the success themselves, but trying to almost like push it away so that they can feel like they're not going to threaten their family. I don't feel like I'm going to cause some kind of disruption to my self experience or to my family. Or you can think about this with like attention, right? Why do some people when they have a birthday party or something like that, even though everyone's there to celebrate them and it should feel good in a final like affirmation of like, oh, we all love you and it's okay, that they almost kind of want to like block it out. They don't want to hear it. It's too much. Well, what is that too much? It's too much for their current perception of how their world is, who they are, that has been formed like the elephant in the cage into this really small box of how they experience themselves.
And it's so sad. I think that is part of trauma, is it is such an adaptive force in a harsh environment. And at the same time, when you are in a safe environment, it is a very painful way to live. And it is very sad. And I think something that results, talking about kind of these 5 structures here, is trust issues. So I see this all the time with clients, in that in many ways it's difficult to trust what you're seeing. Again, when it blurs with the past, or you've encountered so many experiences of the same thing that it only makes sense. It only makes sense that you would learn, right? And I think that's what's so difficult for people too, is and another way to identify if there might be some trauma there. If you take inventory of your relationships, and even in the peaceful ones, are you coming in and needing to in some ways make it a harsher environment to feel like it fits? Oftentimes I can see clients leave situations before they can be left. And a lot of things, I think, result in having a mismatch between an environment that's designed for you to connect and to relax. You can go into the biology to rest and digest, and having a brain structure that's designed to keep you alive in a harsh world.
Yeah. Yeah. That's you're using this example kind of somebody who maybe has every reason to trust, right? Like a relationship or something like this. And yet they might create the conditions that feel more familiar to them because it makes them feel safe. It's kind of like, I picture like, when you watch a scary movie and you can't see where the monster is, like you just want to see the thing, like I'm thinking about like when I first saw Jaws when I was a kid, it was like, I just want to see the shark. If I see the shark, then something kind of cools down, you know, like, but when I can't see the shark, where the shark is in the water and like that, there's so much in your mind that's preoccupied with where is the shark, but I think with trauma, we can kind of search like that of like, where is the pain? Where is the thing that I'm in a close relationship? We've been dating for a long time. I know he or she is going to abandon me. And that kind of anxiety can be too much. And so we can like try to make something happen so that we can go, there it is. I knew it, and that can feel sadly safer than just going, oh, maybe there is no shark. Maybe I'm okay now, because there's this part of us that will use our past to try to anticipate what's going to happen in the future. It's like a template of, I know how this goes. I know how these things go. So as we're thinking about it, what are some waypoints that you've noticed as somebody's healing from trauma? Because I think a lot of this can feel almost like deterministic of like, so trauma informed our brain. And so now this is just what we're left with. But there is a process, right, of healing and growth that our minds are looking for. At the same time, as much as they're looking for the trauma, they're also looking to heal or release something. What have you noticed in terms of the kind of waypoints or the kind of chapters that somebody goes through or needs to go through in order to heal from some of these things?
Yeah. Well, I would start first by saying, in many ways, time, you see it taking time. I think oftentimes it can feel like there's no movement, or it's frustrating for clients, for people, that, they're still having the same stress response. They're still their anxiety is still heightened. And I think that um, generally it is coming down to um, the things that we've talked about. I mean, we can even go back to the body and how you were talking about, let's say, IBS or anxiety. A lot of those things are like external symptoms that could be connected to a lot of things. But specifically with trauma, I think what you start to see is some of that reduce itself, almost like swelling around an injury, starting to reduce itself. I think another one is really when the same dynamics or environments that have you've consistently shown up in the same way, when you start to see, no matter how small, a subtle shift, maybe a slight expansion of more tolerance for something that would otherwise shut you down instantly, get you to become bigger instantly, a little more widening of tolerance. I think that's really indicative that someone is processing through this trauma. And when I think about clients that are processing their trauma, the word that comes to mind is slow. So in many ways, you're kind of meeting the nature of your brain structure with kind of an organic sense. So something like therapy, when you're engaging in talking through an event that was overwhelming, or challenging or frightening, really it comes down to the pace and the comfort and the initiative of the person. And when you kind of tailor everything around the natural timing of that particular person, things start to unfold. Things start to shift from that protective to a more connective space. And again, to keep mentioning the animals, another really interesting phenomenon you see in nature, actually having to do with therapy a lot. Horses with therapy is many times an abused horse or a horse that was in a harsh, terrible situation. It will take them years to coming around to something being different. The brain is so wired for caution. And so I think in some ways, coming to mind as someone that likes to surf is like respect of the ocean. In many ways, respecting the brain structure is kind of what allows people the space to start choosing differently.
So you're saying that kind of what someone should expect is some kind of gentleness and patience with themselves, that they're going to be processing this, and there's not going to be just a quick fix or an overnight thing that's going to happen. But what does happen, it sounds like, is that as you talk about it, there's like an awareness that grows as you talk, in that they start to become less, you said, inflamed, these different, there's like a change in blood flow, let's say in the brain, where the amygdala calms down a bit. They have a lot more prefrontal activity, and that even, you said, even when there's this tiny opening of this window of tolerance where they can experience themselves differently, that can be something that's really encouraging for a client as they start to grow, to see like, oh, I'm picturing like, oh, I'm doing it, I didn't blow up, or I didn't feel so scared when this happened, is kind of what they can expect with healing.
Yes, very much so. I am forgetting who says this quote, but between a stimulus and a response, there's a space. And in many ways, it's that watching that space get bigger for choice. So seeing clients be able to respond, overreact, and celebrating the small, gradual wins.
That's a wonderful quote. Who is that? Is that Otto Kernberg? Is that who that is? I don't know. I'll have to Rollo May. Rollo May is who it is. Yeah. But yeah, that's a wonderful quote. And I think it captures it perfectly. You said between the stimulus and response, we want to kind of create this space, and that space has something to do with who we are as people, and if there's no gap between stimulus and response, if whenever I hear a word, I immediately react, and out of anger or out of fear or out of depression, I'm not really engaging with myself in a full way. I'm not really being a person in that moment, I'm reducing something in my mind, right? Not out of choice, obviously, but he's saying like as we kind of put space between a stimulus and response, as someone says something to us, and we can actually rest with something or process something before we respond. I think that is a wonderful picture for what healing can look like, and also what happens in the therapy room too. I mean, you're literally
Yes.
talking about having somebody talk about what they're experiencing, and they might feel it, and then in the therapy room, you're slowing them down so that they can actually process it. They can understand what's going on for them before they just respond, before they have like a freak out, or like, you know, they say something they regret or something like this. But I think that's a good picture for it.
Yes, yes. And therapy too. I mean, in the healing of trauma, being with a person that can lend you their capacity as you're growing that space is, you know, an incredibly helpful tool.